Thank you so much. Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to everyone who's joining us today. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that I am joining you from the traditional territories of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Huron-Wendat, and the Anishinaabe. As perfunctory as land acknowledgements have become, I offer this as a way of remembering the ongoing legacies of colonial violence and genocide upon which this nation was built. I'd also like to begin by thanking the organizers for inviting me and offering me the opportunity to share some opening remarks to set the stage for this conference. Now I'm going to attempt to share my screen, which is the most nerve-wracking part of what I'm doing for me because I have multiple screens. I think you're going to have to enable me to share my screen if I could let the organizers know that. I have multiple screens, and so my boomer brain kicks in on which one I'm actually going to share. Let me see if this works. Okay. Now, technically. Okay. Sharma, can you let me know if you can see the full screen?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Thanks so much. My talk today is going to focus on Canada, and I think it's important in having a conversation about Islamophobia and its saliency in the world today for those of us who are in Canada, and this conference is being held in Canada, to begin by reflecting on the conditions of Islamophobia in this country. And it's important because of the 2 mass murders that have taken place against Muslims in the past 4 years at the hands of white nationalists in Canada. Excuse me. And so I want to begin by reflecting on these tragic incidents. 6 months ago, in London, Ontario, a Pakistani Muslim family were taking an evening stroll. One of the few things that we do during lockdown in the pandemic is to be able to go out and walk in our neighborhood with the rest of our family or friends, or even by ourselves. And as this family was doing, as they did every evening, going out for a walk, they were mowed down by a truck targeted for extermination on the basis of their faith and identity. So this is the Afzal family, or Pakistani Muslims. And this happened on June 6th, 2021. And this is a very, I think, created a lot of sadness across the country, a lot of shock, although for many of us, we'd already been primed to the kind of Islamophobic animus that exists that sets the stage for these kinds of acts. The next slide I'm going to share is very troubling to look at, so I'm warning as I'm sharing it. Right after that horrific, tragic event, this was posted on a site called Telegram, which is one of the far-right sort of, sites that they congregate and share information. And whenever someone commits a crime against Muslims, particularly when they kill Muslims, in that particular subculture, they become sated. So the perpetrator of this crime was named Nathaniel Veltman, and he became Saint Nathaniel in this subculture. And you can see on the left side of the screen the same photo I was just showing you of the Afzal family. 4 members of the family were killed, and a 9-year-old boy was left fighting for his life. But how they've been represented here as invaders, and with the label of dead invaders and then injured invader for the young boy. And again, this was represented through a far-right group that are the source of a lot of the white nationalist, Islamophobic rhetoric, conspiracy theories, and so on that are undergirding a lot of this kind of violence. And so this is how it was taken up on those websites. And notably, the Ontario police did cite this as a hate-motivated crime, and so it was identified as an act of Islamophobia from right from the beginning. Prior to this, on January 29th, 2017, it was the worst mass murder in a house of worship in Canadian history, when 6 Muslim men were shot dead after evening prayers in a Quebec City mosque. They were a local halal grocery store owner, a professor at the University of Laval, 3 civil servants, and a pharmacy worker who were brutally slain that night. They came from Morocco, Algeria, and Guinea, and they were fathers, sons, husbands, brothers, and respected members of the Muslim community. So those 2 tragedies represent, in 4 years, 2 mass terror attacks against Muslims in Canada. So when we look at the face of white nationalist terror and Islamophobic paranoia, this was a quote from Alexander Bissonnette, who was responsible for the Quebec mosque terror attack. And he confessed to police that he'd been motivated by Trudeau's message of welcome to refugees following Donald Trump's ban on 7 Muslim majority countries. And it was noted that he visited, several hundred times Donald Trump's page, as well as the pages of many other, online Islamophobic ideologues in Canada and elsewhere. And he stated that, I was watching TV and I learned that the Canadian government was going to take on more refugees who couldn't go to the United States, and they were coming here. I saw this and I lost my mind. I don't want us to become like Europe. I don't want them to kill my parents, my family. I had to do something. I couldn't do nothing. It was something that tortured me. And so what we see in his statement here is this sense of Islamophobic paranoia, a kind of idea of a demographic replacement, and the fear that Muslims are going to take over and wreak violence. And I'll speak more about some of these conspiracy theories and ideologies in a minute. But I also want us to not forget that in 2020, in September, caretaker of a mosque in Toronto, Mohammed Aslam Zafi, was stabbed to death by someone who was identified by the Canadian Anti-Hate Network as being part of a satanic neo-Nazi death cult. And so these examples show us that Islamophobia has reached violent and deadly proportions in this country. So I've dedicated many years to trying to unpack Canadian Islamophobia, and right now I have 2 projects that are sort of the jumping off point for my talk today, and so I wanted to introduce those to you. The first is my book, Under Siege, Islamophobia and the 9/11 Generation, which will be out in the spring. And it involves 6 years of field work with over 130 Muslim youth and youth workers, community leaders across the country, and provide some important theoretical contributions to the field of Islamophobia studies, along with some rich ethnographic data about this 9/11 generation. And so that's one of the areas that has been work that I've been doing for several years now to try and unpack Islamophobia in Canada. And the second project, which will also be released in the new year, is on the Canadian Islamophobia industry. And this is a very detailed book length report about the Islamophobia industry, and I'll explain what that means, and who the players are and the connections between them, and how they are working very actively to promote networks of bigotry and hate in Canada. And so those are the 2 sort of jumping off points for this talk. And so when we look at this idea of the 9/11 generation, we look back to September 11th, which ushered in a period through which neo-imperial war was drawn along the global fault lines of race, religion, class, and nationality. During this time, in the state of exception that was created, Islamophobia became wedded with the security industrial complex and created racialized forms of governmentality and surveillance. The generation of Muslim youth who have come of age during these turbulent times have a unique legacy because they haven't known a world before the aftermath and backlash surrounding these events. And so in this book, I'm grappling with the question that decades before W.E.B. Du Bois poised in The Souls of Black Folk, when he asked the poignant question, how does it feel to be a problem? And, and explain that concept of double consciousness, of how you seeing yourself, how others perceive you, and the kind of meanings that get attached to particular bodies. And I felt that that was an important question to grapple with in trying to unpack the experiences of Muslim youth who are part of this 9/11 generation. So a question that my book is addressing is, 20 years after the 9/11 attacks, how have the global war on terror and heightened anti-Muslim racism affected a generation of Canadians who were socialized into a world where their faith and identity are under siege? And so answering this question involved unraveling the social, political, and cultural context of Canadian Islamophobia. So I'll share some of that with you today. And it was very important for me to start with a definition or framework for Islamophobia, because how we constitute a problem then impacts how we can intervene in it. And many of the ways people tended to understand Islamophobia was quite literally as that sort of fear of Islam or Muslims. And unfortunately, that definition is very partial and really only attends to an interpersonal level of where people, see each other as the other or are fearful of others. And that does not allow us to address the systemic aspects of Islamophobia or the ideological underpinnings. And so I felt it was important to have a definition and framework, more of a sociological framework for Islamophobia. And I came up with that in 2004, and I've also used it to frame my book. And so I've extended that definition from simply a fear or hatred of Islam or Muslims, or of course anyone perceived to be Muslim, because we know, excuse me, of all attacks and violence against Sikhs, for example, who are often misidentified as Muslims. So it could be anyone who's perceived to be Muslim. So that fear or hatred, though, translates into individual, ideological, and systemic forms of oppression that support the logic and rationale of specific power relations. So we cannot talk about any form of oppression without situating it within those relationships of power and understanding the dynamics through which it operates. And so I'm going to review some of that throughout this presentation as a way of unpacking those dimensions of Islamophobia. So when we talk about individual actions, we can see those as in this visual as sort of just the tip of the iceberg. These acts are justified through Islamophobic ideas and stereotypes that circulate with impunity and serve to legitimate the systemic practices in various institutions in society, such as education, social services, healthcare, law, social and governmental policy. And so this is perhaps a useful visual to encapsulate how this dynamic works. So what we see on the top are those more visible aspects, but what is undergirding and propping up the system and allowing it to reproduce are those ideologies and systemic practices. Now, I do in the book talk about all of the different debates around the definitions of Islamophobia, and also touch on the issue of anti-Muslim racism, which some scholars are preferring to use as opposed to Islamophobia. But I don't think we can take Islam out of Islamophobia. And I argue that anti-Muslim racism is a manifestation of Islamophobia. So those forms of violence, hatred, and discrimination that are enacted against Muslims. But since anti-Muslim racism relies on the demonization of Islam, one does not exist without the other. And into that understanding, we also have to look at the racialization of religion and how racial characteristics have been ascribed to religious groups. So that helps us round out that understanding. So just to go over this dynamic, when we look at individual acts of Islamophobia, and we can see these as some of the images here where you see the one gift wrapped pig's head that was left at the door of the mosque that a year later became the site of the Quebec mosque shooting, and it had a card that said Bon Appetit. So that is one kind of hate crime. The swastika that was spray painted on a mosque, I believe that was in Edmonton. We see some posters of a Muslim woman who was running for city council being defaced, and there were attacks against Black Muslim women also in Edmonton. And a lot of those things happened even after the last attack in London, Ontario. And so there's often an uptick of these kinds of hate crimes, and particularly visibly marked Muslim women are targets of that particular kind of gendered Islamophobic violence. But there's also the day-to-day kind of microaggressions that Muslims, have to contend with. Name calling that can happen, epithets, as well as the physical sexual harassment and violence are also acts of exclusion. Social distancing, which I don't mean in a pandemic context, but mean in the sociological context of wanting to maintain distance from particular social and cultural groups. As well as the vandalism and hate crimes that I've also mentioned here. So those are the tip of the iceberg. What's below that surface and what's underwriting and justifying those kinds of actions are the ideologies. In this study on the Canadian Islamophobia industry, we were able to look at some of the dominant ideologies of Islamophobia that are being purveyed through these networks, and how those create Muslims as particular kinds of folk devils and construct moral panics around the Muslim presence. And that is, relayed through a lot of conspiracy theories that work through these networks and find themselves in fake news, but also in some mainstream conceptions. So some of these ideas or ideologies have to do with Muslims as being illiberal or anti-democratic, and therefore, pre-modern, and not able to integrate into, secular liberal democracies. I think one of the most prominent tropes really globally is that of the Islamist boogeyman, or this idea that there is this global conspiracy theory that, Islamists are going to take over Western nations and install Sharia law and, overthrow Western democracy and society. That's probably one of the most prevalent ones. And related to that is the way Muslims are conceived of as a kind of Trojan horse. And this, again, this trope of the Muslim invader that we saw in a very obscene way attached to the bodies of the victims, the Afzal family in that image that I showed you at the outset. So this trope of the Muslim invader is very popular and has been popularized along with this idea of the Trojan horse that just opens up with Muslims coming in and taking over society. And how they perceive that Muslims are doing this is through this notion of taqiyya, that Muslims are basically wolves in sheep's clothing and are willfully deceiving people, and showing themselves as being good citizens, as being generally nice people, but that there is a nefarious intention that they are hiding through that facade. And so that's a very common perception in these Islamophobia ecosystems. And of course, that comes through this dominant narrative of the creeping Sharia. So Muslims are trying in various ways to implement Sharia law, which will eventually undermine Western civilization. A lot of the more far-right white nationalist groups attach that also to demographic replacement or civilizational jihad, where it's also the biological kind of replacement that Muslims will also outnumber eventually, white populations in the West and become replaced. And that they will do that also culturally through a kind of civilizational jihad. And so those are, the kinds of conspiracy theories that are promoted mostly by the far-right white nationalist groups. But all of these conspiracy theories come from a variety of different Islamophobic players and actors who are more increasingly working together to circulate these narratives. Of course, there is the jihadist terrorist moniker, which is we've known for a very long time that Muslims get characterized like that, and that is consistently promoted. Even in the Quebec Mosque massacre, there was a theory of a second shooter, which was a Muslim. And so even when Muslims are the victim, they are still reproduced as the potential terrorist. Of course, there's the oppressed Muslim woman narrative, which, manifests in a number of ways that, then lead to this need to rescue Muslim women, saving brown women from brown men, as Gayatri Spivak talked about. And that's, again, a very popular trope in these subcultures, as well as in society. And also this idea of weaponizing the Quran, so how Quranic verses are taken out of context, decontextualized, dehistoricized, and are used to fortify these particular kinds of claims and conspiracy theories. And often the people that are doing that weaponizing would be maybe ex-Muslims or Muslim dissidents, so that adds a level of authorization and authority to those ideas. So those are some of the ideologies. There are more, but these are some of the dominant ones that we have been looking at that are also evident in Canada. Attached to those ideologies are the ways that it becomes expressed in the public sphere. And so, my research team working on the Islamophobia Industry Project did a series of fact sheets for the Bridge Initiative at Georgetown University on Islamophobia in Canada. One of them looked at the distilling the polls in Canada, public opinion polls from about 2004 to the present. And we've also got an updated version of that in the report coming out. These are just a couple of highlights of, what stories the polls tell us about Canada's public opinion about Muslim presence. And so we see things like, majority of Muslims, majority of Canadians, 67%, agreeing that immigrants should be screened for anti-Canadian values. That was a poll in 2017, and in the same poll, those respondents, 51% across Canada, 57% in Quebec, felt the presence of Muslims in this country made them somewhat or very worried about security. In an earlier poll in March 2015, a national poll found that 68% of Canadians disagreed with allowing Muslim women to wear niqab or burqa during citizenship ceremonies. And 72% agreed that the burqa or niqab are symbols of oppression that are rooted in an anti-woman culture. And then in 2012, multiculturalism revealed that 52% of Canadians distrust Muslims, and 42% believe that discrimination against Muslims is mainly their fault, right? So there's a kind of victim blaming there. And so again, this references some of the public sentiment. So it isn't just the conspiracy theories of the far-right white nationalists and Islamophobia industry, but some of these anti-Muslim sentiments are very clear in larger surveys and polls of Canadians. So one of the ways that Islamophobia is distinct from other kinds of oppression is that there is an industry behind its promotion that is working, 24/7 with funding to promote Islamophobic bigotry. And so when we look at the Islamophobia industry, it's comprised of media outlets, special interest groups, think tanks, political figures, individual ideologues, or what I call Islamophobia influencers, far-right groups, and the donors that support these campaigns. Research in the United States has shown that the Islamophobia industry there is funded over $1 billion through philanthropic organizations and other groups. And some of that support filters into Canada as well. And we've looked at how hate is being monetized in this country in that report. And so these individuals, groups, and institutions comprise a global network that supports activities that demonize and marginalize Islam and Muslims. And so while they've looked at how this industry operates in the United States, this is the first time that we are looking at how the industry operates in Canada. And so here's just a visual, graphic of the different players in the Islamophobia industry. So we look at media outlets like Rebel Media, which is kind of ground zero for a lot of the industry players. Some of the individual ideologues like Faith Goldie, Lauren Southern were sort of birthed in Rebel Media. They are now on their own Islamophobia influencers. We also have, as I've mentioned, the white nationalist groups, which are what we call the foot soldiers of Islamophobia. There's about 300 of those groups in Canada. And we've profiled about a dozen or so that are specifically have Islamophobia as their mandate and are very active in promoting that in a variety of ways in concert with many of the other players. So this is a networked system. Behind the system, we have also the soft power groups that are religious groups that are pro-Israel, Zionist, Jewish and Zionist Christian groups that are in alliance also in promoting Islamophobic ideologies and activities and work in concert with other parts of this industry. A big player is also the Muslim dissidents and ex-Muslims who are sort of the native informers, as Hamid Dabashi would have called them, to support and authorize some of the anti-Muslim Islamophobic narratives that are out there. There's also politicians that echo many of and dog whistle to many of these groups through their Islamophobic rhetoric. There are think tanks and security experts that are also providing a certain kind of cult of expertise that lends to the securitization industry in Canada. And of course, there are policies, social policies, as we've seen in Quebec, that are also providing a context for Islamophobic sentiments to become quite normalized. And this is just some of the kinds of connections between these groups. So I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, but just wanted to give you a bit of introduction to that work that we've been doing. So as much as these fringe groups and industries are operating, in concerted ways to orchestrate controversy and to promote Islamophobia, I would argue that liberal forms of Islamophobia are actually more problematic. And so liberal Islamophobia arises when you have Islamophilia, marked by cultural fascination and fetishism and the sort of celebration of Muslims, meets Islamophobia. So the paradox of these two contradictory impulses of fetishistic fascination and racial disavowal shapes the political and cultural terrain of multiculturalism. More than the other extreme variants of Islamophobia that I've mentioned, liberal Islamophobia does the work of normalizing anti-Muslim racism with greater legitimacy and institutional power. So Canada's combination of secularism and multiculturalism works in tandem to offer the illusion of equitable inclusion, while each provides a camouflage for the other and obscures how they function to limit and exclude religious cultures. So this is what I refer to as a kind of racial secularization. So, for example, Bill 21 in Quebec is where we see religious rights being sacrificed on this altar of secular interculturalism. And so where these sorts of, policies and practices are enacted that are targeting Muslims and are promoting Islamophobia at the same time as we have these sort of liberal multicultural ideals of, celebrating cultures and having this sort of mosaic society, right? So those sort of irreconcilable tensions are part of this liberal Islamophobia. And so, for example, some of these systemic practices that are the product of liberal Islamophobia in Canada are things like the Zero Tolerance for Barbaric Cultural Practices Act, and the corresponding tip line that was proposed by conservative Kelly Leach, which was referenced around ideas of forced marriage, female genital mutilation, honor killing that were always linked to Muslim cultures and bodies. And of course, we have systems of racial and religious profiling, discrimination in employment, and other sectors. And again, this racial secularization, gendered Islamophobia, and what I call coerced unveiling through bans on religious attire, whether it's the hijab or niqab in the public sphere, schools, sports, citizenship ceremonies, and so on. And so these are just some of the range of systemic practices that allow Islamophobia to become wedded into the institutional apparatus of society and therefore reproduced. And again, part of the systemic practices include Canada's security regime. I talk about in my book, I talk about the security industrial complex and Islamophobia. And some of the kinds of policies in Canada that have contributed to that security industrial complex are Bill C-51, or the Anti-Terrorism Act, which really allowed, for a kind of pre-crime detention of anyone suspected of engaging in terrorism. Security certificates, which are part of the Immigration Refugee Protection Act, that have been issued against non-citizens. And we know of the 5 Muslim men who've been held since 2000, who were called the Secret Trial 5, because security certificates operate within what Giorgio Agamben talked about as that state of exception, where you can have secret trials and secret evidence being used against you, be indefinitely detained, and really liquidate all forms of democracy and the rule of law. And there have really been the 5 Muslim men called the Secret Trial 5 who were part of that regime. We also have the dynamic of flying while Muslim. And in Canada, that has been institutionalized through the Passenger Protect program, or what's been called the no-fly list. We've even had Muslim toddlers have their names on the no-fly list in this country. And so these are among the policies that have cast Muslims as potential threats to national security and are part of the systemic practices of Islamophobia. So now just to bring this down to, how do all of these individual ideological systemic practices create a context within which this 9/11 generation of Muslim youth are coming of age, have come of age, and are negotiating their identities, right, within this very fraught terrain that is impacted by these domestic conditions and policies, but also in the larger context of the geopolitical context of the war on terror. And so in my book, I was interested in looking at the impacts of Islamophobia on citizenship, identity, and belonging, surveillance of Muslim youth, and what their concerns about how of the radicalization industry and CVE, and how they have been recruited into that as potential radicals and jihadists. I didn't want to write a book that really only looked at the vilification of Muslim youth and how they navigate that, but also, situated them as agents of resistance. And so my final chapter looks at how Muslim youth are resisting through activism and the arts in particular, and how they have become cultural producers and are trying to present and authorize and create alternative narratives about the Muslim experience. And so what was interesting for me, and what I really wanted to grapple with, having looked at Islamophobia for 20 years now, was looking at the affective registers of Islamophobia. And so when we talk about the affective registers, I was inspired by this notion of an emotional geopolitics that Rachel Payne talks about. And she, acknowledges that these are, quote, the feelings, perceptions, views, subjectivities, or bodies who experience the outcomes of geopolitical decisions and processes firsthand during their everyday lives. So in other words, the war on terror has become a lived experience, not just a geopolitical construct. And I wanted to understand more how, affect plays into the ways that Islamophobia is being managed and navigated, particularly through how Muslim youth are being socialized into these contexts. So I have been asking the questions about how Muslim youth negotiate their identities in times of war and terror, that are shaping popular understandings of who they are and how others perceive them. and how these discourses constitute Muslim youth as post 9/11 subjects, and how they respond to that ontological positioning. And then how these affective registers of Islamophobia are configured. So I'm just going to share with you, in conclusion here, a couple of the themes that emerged in my study on the 9/11 generation. And so one of these themes is this notion that I developed of securitized habitus. And I'm drawing on Bourdieu here. And I contend that the post 9/11 condition in the West has created a specific securitized habitus, where Muslims and society at large have become conditioned in this fraught environment and the ideologies and practices that are produced by it. So Bourdieu talked about habitus as an expression of certain dispositions, so the thoughts, perceptions, expressions, and actions that are products of a specific environment into which people become socialized and are unconsciously conditioned within that. And so other scholars that have examined the 9/11 generation, like Sinai and Myra, also argues that there's a particular subjectivity and imperial feeling to the post 9/11 era that transcends the global war on terror and is connected to material and political structures of power that are evident in everyday life, whether it's in pop culture, migration, or the formations of national belonging. Also, in looking at the affective conditions engendered by the war on terror, Ramda Abdel Fattah talks about the maps of meanings, ideas, feelings, and social images that are constructed to situate young Muslims as a category of risk. And so these sort of affective registers become this site of kind of interpolation where Muslims become recruited into these discourses and ideas that have been popularized since the war on terror, but they are also internalizing them, right? So the interpolation and the internalization. And part of that internalization I found was through this panopticon of self-surveillance. So, you know, when I would talk to Muslim youth about what their Muslim student associations were doing, they would tell me things like, well, we were going to go play paintball up north, but we didn't want to be seen as if we were a jihadist, training camp. So we didn't do that. But then I would ask them, okay, but then, so how did 9/11 affect you? And they would say, well, it didn't affect me, because it became sort of a new normal. But then if I press further, they would tell me that, well, but we don't actually play violent video games in the concourse of our university or in public spaces because we don't want people to think that, we're violent or we're going to blow up the building, but 9/11 didn't affect them. And so, these are some of the ways that this self-surveillance, has been internalized by Muslim youth as just part of the way that the new normal in how they navigate this world. There's also a burden of representation that they feel in terms of, the collective guilt that is leveled against Muslims for, the actions of 19 hijackers, but the entire, Muslim world must have to account for that and be responsible for that. So Muslim youth also fall into this good Muslim, bad Muslim kind of, form of performativity where they really want to show that, well, look, we are the good Muslims, so we are going to make sure that we are emissaries of Islam and good ambassadors of Islam and present ourselves to the world so that they can see the good in Islam and in Muslim behavior and action, so that we are not the bad Muslims and we are not seen as the terrorists. And so that becomes part of how they are navigating this world, right, is to be constructed as the good Muslim. And also I'm finding that there's even either an investment or an estrangement from their identity. So for a lot of them who were maybe not as invested in their Muslimness prior to the backlash of 9/11 and when Islamophobia became far more heightened in that era, although of course it has a longer genealogy and history than that, it made many of them want to invest in that identity to set the record straight, to show people who they were really as Muslims and in ways that they didn't feel like they had to do before. But for others, they became estranged from their identity and started to anglicize their names or just not be openly connected to what became a socially devalued and vilified identity. So those are just some of the themes that emerged from my book as some of the affective responses and strategies that Muslim youth have developed in dealing with this context. And so in conclusion, I just wanted to leave with sort of where I end my book as well, and that is to look at how Muslim youth are resisting and how they are using the arts as a form of resistance. And so these are some of the interventions that Muslim youth artists and cultural producers have made. For example, in the middle, these are scenes from Conflict Relief, which is an Israeli-Palestinian comedy troupe that was the brainchild of a Canadian Palestinian actor. And the group is actually was in the UK, but had Canadian representation in that. And then you have on the right side, sorry, on the left, Tug of War, which was a contribution by Buna Mohammed, who is a Canadian spoken word artist, actor, and writer producer, who was trying to shift the narrative of radicalization and youth in that film. And then you have interventions, and the final two I'm going to show are actually work that my son is involved with. So at the bottom is Fame and Fidelity, which was a web series he did a few years ago that won some awards, and was his attempt to talk about how, a comedic attempt to deal with the fact that he, as a Muslim, as an Arab Pakistani Muslim, was trying to be an actor, but was always getting typecast as terrorist number 4. And so he did a comedic take on that. And then his more recent intervention was a documentary called I Am Rohingya, A Genocide in 4 Acts, that was a sort of a product of ethnographic theater, refugee theater, that looked at how refugee Muslim youth in Canada who dealt with the genocide in Burma, and lived in refugee camps in Bangladesh and then found their way to Canada, wanted to tell their stories through theater. And so they did this ethnographic play, which became the basis of this documentary. And so I wanted to leave with that, so that, in the spirit of where do we go from here and what are the interventions that are being made to address Islamophobia, that we can see that already Muslims are part of that project, are part of envisioning alternative futures and putting out counter stories and counter narratives to address the way that their identities have otherwise been cast in very negative and limiting tropes. And so I'm hoping that is a kind of hopeful note to end my talk on. So thank you very much. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I'm happy to address any questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Zine, for that very thought-provoking, as well as sharing your book. I wanted to see if we have discussions. We have a few more minutes from our panelists, our participants here, for Dr. Zine. Okay. Does anybody have any questions?
Patrice has his hand up.
Okay, sure. Yes, Patrice.
Thank you, Charmaine. First of all, let me thank Jasmine. It's wonderful, Jasmine, to actually hear you again in greater and greater depth and precisions. And it's incredibly rich what you've presented today. And it's the obviously years of work that you've invested in allowing us to learn from you so much. And it really sets the stage beautifully, intellectually, as well as emotionally, to talk to this topic, which is of course very challenging for all of us in so many different ways. So thank you, really deeply grateful to you. My question has to do with the one slide where you talked about liberal Islamophobia. And suddenly I realized that at the bottom of it, you know, you had mentioned sort of Bill 21, which comes out from a particular ideological perspective, which we'll hear more about sort of in my presentation a little bit, and possibly also Zainab's presentation even more, but from a particular political ideological frame, which I would not quite call liberal, you know, to be honest. And so I was wondering if within the broader Canadian sort of scene, one could possibly distinguish between sort of, you know, liberal Islamophobia and for lack of a better word, sort of a conservative Islamophobia from that political sort of perspective of the two main political parties in Canada. And so unless, of course, you were using liberal in a completely different sense, which is probably the case. So anyway, I just would love to hear more about that.
Thank you. Yes, I am using liberal broader. It is really something, liberal Islamophobia, you know, moves across political categories. It has not just about the Liberal Party, but we know the Liberal Party in Quebec has supported many of the same policies as the Conservative parties have. So, but my use of the term liberal Islamophobia is not about any particular party, but about the way that these policies are presented within this landscape of either we are multicultural, we are intercultural, you know, we want to, on the one hand, say that we support these particular kinds of dynamics and want this inclusive, plural society. On the other hand, we have policies that are very clearly targeting and are very racialized in their conception and implementation, right? So you have, that's why I sort of talk about it as kind of Islamophilia meets Islamophobia, right? Where you have both of these contradictory impulses of this sort of fetishistic fascination. So let's have Islamic History Month and let's do these festivals and let's do, you know, all of this. And then on the other hand, you have the racial disavowal that is still very, very clear and evident, and is part of the kinds of the political cultural terrain, and especially becomes enshrined in these policies. So that's what I was trying to characterize.
Thank you.
And thank you. And I remember, Patrice, many years ago coming to do a talk where you were, I think, doing a presentation and talking about some of this research at an early stage about Muslim youth. So it's nice to be able to share it with you when it's fine, when it's more has been finished and is coming out in the world.
Thank you.
Okay, Ibrahim, did you have a question? Comment?
Oh yeah, a really quick one. Thank you, Jasmine, for this amazing presentation. I can't wait to read the book. I think it's also gonna help me much with my own research. One thing that I got really interested into, because I'm looking at it presently myself from different angles, is the way in which people you talked with talked about, like, you know, video games and how they, like, you know, hide the fact that they were playing certain games on campus. A lot of these games are played online, and I wanted to ask you if they told you about, like, you know, the way in which they, like, maybe coded themselves online, presented themselves online as Muslims or not, and how they reacted to also maybe, like, you know, some Islamophobic comments that could be made online. In these video games, you often have, like, you know, racist comments that are made by different players, and I thought it could be interesting to ask you that. Maybe you got that type of yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ibrahim, for the question. Actually, I note in the book that, in fact, nobody talked about online harassment, you know, or anything that was happening particularly online. And maybe I should have asked more about it, but I do think that's a really good area for future research. You know, and especially how gaming has been used and part of particularly militarization, you know, because the US Army game, right, was used to recruit racialized and low income young people across the United States to serve in the war on terror. So they would take these violent video games to malls in areas that were low income and racialized as a recruiting tool, right? And there was something like almost 1 million players that were playing this game online. And I know that there's a lot more of these video games that have Islamophobic reference and so on. My son is into gaming. I'm not at all part of that subculture, so it wouldn't be my project, but I really think it's an important area to start looking at, because we know that a lot of these hate groups proliferate online. They incubate in these, chat rooms, but they've now also become emboldened to be out on the streets and in other kinds of forums. But I think there's a lot of these sort of subcultures, gaming subcultures, that promote Islamophobia. And so, yeah, I'd probably have to talk more to my son about how some of that happens. But interestingly, none of the youth in my study talked about that online forum. So that would be a good follow-up, I think, for someone to do.
Thank you.
Maybe you'll do that.
Hopefully.
Inshallah.
Okay. Do you have any other comments, questions from our conference panelists?
I think Roshan.
Another?
Roshan?
Yes, Roshan.
Hello, assalamu alaikum. Hope everyone's doing well. Thank you. I was just wondering, Jasmine, when you were talking about the Canadian Islamophobia industry and the different sort of players that, especially global players that are implicated in that network, did you notice any sort of like Anglo-Franco divide between, like some of the networks and, who becomes part of it? For example, maybe some of the, news media or think tanks are influenced, maybe more by like the US or the UK, whereas some of the ones maybe in Quebec would be influenced maybe by France or other networks and donors, maybe in the French-speaking, the globalized Francophone context. So I was just wondering if you noticed any kind of linguistic divide between the different networks and who populates it.
So, we did look at Le Mout in Quebec, and so we have profiled them and looked at some of, there are some ideologues that have been sort of politicians in Quebec, some ex-Muslims, that sort of thing. As far as, when we look at how hate is monetized and bankrolled in Canada, we really can't do the kinds of forensic accounting that they can in the United States, simply because those records are available there and they're not available here. But we have been able to trace how some of the key organizations like Middle East Forum, Gatestone, Shulman Foundation, and Clarion have been bankrolling and have been supporting particular groups and ideologues and influencers in Canada. In terms of the sort of Francophone, Anglophone divide, I mean, there's obviously some, there are some groups that are active, in Quebec, and we've noted that, but I haven't necessarily, we can't really trace any kind of if anything's being funded, from France. I think it's more the ideological currency that is salient in these networks and sort of where these ideas are coming from and circulating, right? Rather than just the, but you can sort of trace things like how Lauren Southern, there's not talking about the Francophone, but, was connected with Martin Sellner in Austria and, was part of the white nationalist group that bought this boat called the Sea Star that was used to keep refugees coming from North Africa, continental Africa, out of Europe. So they would go after the boats that were, Médecins Sans Frontières, and all of these other humanitarian groups that were trying to rescue migrants that were coming in, and they would go out and try and thwart those groups. And that was bankrolled a lot through Generation Identity, that group, which has some chapters in Canada now, but Lauren Southern became one of the figureheads for that particular anti-immigrant movement. So we see the global ties more in that way. I haven't seen anything specific with any of the players that we've looked at, in terms of specific ties to France. Mind you, none of us in this study are Francophone speakers, so we are limited. And that often becomes, the case. So maybe as our report comes out, someone will dig a little deeper and can go into looking at these groups in more detail in Quebec, but it's one of the limitations that we had, unfortunately. But we do actually talk quite a bit about the policies and practices and other sorts of what I see as sort of the liberal forms of Islamophobia in Quebec as part of the context that you need to understand how these networks form and are organized. And we have looked at where we can the formations of some of this in Quebec.
Thank you.
Okay, we have some Q&A from our from our audience. Farouk Hakim is asking, do you see any links, connections between Islamophobia and neoliberalism, as well as Islamophobia and the neoconservative wars on Muslim countries?
Sorry, what was the last part of the question?
Any links between Islamophobia and neoliberalism and Islamophobia and neoconservative wars on Muslim majority countries? Do you see any connections between those?
Okay, well, I mean, when we look at, the broader architecture of the geopolitical context and the way neoliberalism works with, in tandem with the war on terror, for example, and how that has been an industry that promotes Islamophobia, I would look at it, in the context of what I do, that way, or again, the ways that Islamophobic hate has become commercialized, commodified, and is part of a racist currency. I think in terms of, there is, my colleague and friend Fareed Hafez has done work on Islamophobia in Muslim majority countries. And I think there needs to be more conversation about that. And so that's not work that I've done, but that's work that, and Fareed is part of our International Islamophobia Studies Research Association, or ISRA. He's on our board and has been doing excellent work in both Europe and in Muslim majority countries looking at Islamophobia. And, it is very important to, when we talk about Islamophobia, and why I use the framework that I presented to you today is because it allows us to unpack Islamophobia in contexts that are outside of the West, right? So if we talk about Burma or China or India, right, we're talking about Islamophobic ethno-nationalisms that really don't have a lot to do with white nationalism. I don't think everything is going to come from that same root, but when we look at those kinds of Islamophobic ethno-nationalisms, we need to be able to unpack them, in particular ways. And so but the war on terror has also underwritten, let's say, what's happening in China with the Uyghurs. They've used quite a bit the narratives of the war on terror to justify, that campaign. A very unprecedented genocide there, on those grounds, right? And so, and there's definitely, other kinds of factors at play. So, I think it's important to consider all of those dimensions, sort of the larger global structures, and how those are forged within the context of neoliberal economics and war. But again, bringing it down to the level of how this is impacting and affecting, Muslim communities. So I've kind of been trying to do both, because I think a lot of the work has been done on the bigger pieces. And I think now it's sort of looking at these ideas for me in terms of those affective registers, the ideas of how a securitized habitus is being created and how Muslims are navigating in that space, right? And at the same time, how these wider industries are operating to orchestrate controversy and create conspiracy theories that just keeps this dynamic, going.
Okay, thank you for that. Definitely the connections that we that you just mentioned. Another question from Amina Jamal. You mentioned that the Islamophobia industry is uniquely propagated and financed. Did you find any relationship to the events in South Asia, as the recent conference on Hindutva emphasized that ideology as a particularly engaged in bolstering Islamophobia and anti-Muslim racism in the Canadian North American context?
Thank you, Amina. It's good to hear from you. you know, we did look at, and there is, you know, connections to Hindutva nationalism in Canada through the formation of groups like the Canadian Hindu Advocacy Group, Ron Banerjee, and you know, there's another group that was formed called Canadian Hindu Volunteers, and in fact, they were putting out some very you know, very horrific Islamophobic propaganda. And as it happened, one of those people was working at my university as a recruiter, you know, for international students. And after this, you know, some of the terrible memes and Islamophobic rhetoric that this group was putting out that he became tied to, he was fired after that. So yes, we have seen, I don't know specifically about that, you know, a particular event or conference, but I can definitely say that, you know, these groups that are informed by Hindutva nationalism are, you know, part of this industry, and we have looked at that. And so how, you know, it's interesting to see how it's being animated by and borrowing from, you know, these sort of transnational ideologies that are circulating through and are finding expression here in Canada. So, you know, I would say Ron Banerjee, Rise Canada, Canadian Hindu Volunteers are among the key groups in Canada that have been responsible for that. And of course, Ron Banerjee has been, you know, was sued by Mohammed Faki, who is a sort of entrepreneur philanthropist in Canada. One of the, you know, a couple of these ideologues have been sued by the folks who have the means to do that, and have been charged with hate crimes and things like that. So we do see, you know, elements of the Hindutva nationalist Islamophobia being pervade in the networks here. And of course, these networks work with other groups, so they kind of, you know, mix and match their ideologies, because and they're very disparate groups, right? Who you wouldn't think are necessarily, you know, aligned. But, you know, at the same time, they are, you know, when you see the Soldiers of Odin and Jewish Defense League working together, right? So, but they are all aligned through this promotion of anti-Muslim animus and Islamophobia at the core. So whether it's coming from Hindutva or it's coming from, you know, other kinds of political projects, again, like many of the pro-Israel groups are very prominent in this Islamophobic ecosystem. So they are drawing from different kinds of political contexts, which is why, you know, these larger dimensions of Islamophobia globally are so impactful, you know, here in Canada, right? That because we have a diverse society, we are also importing some of these forms of Islamophobia.
Okay, and I think this would be our last question from Nikita Valerio. Given your work with Muslim Canadian youth, what are your recommendations for Muslim organizations looking to support Muslim youth given the all-encompassing Islamophobic context you have described? Additionally, how does a common youth tendency of parsing the oppression they face as something effective expected for Muslims from a religious standpoint of all ages fit into this understanding and framework, as well as the potential approaches taken for supporting them?
Okay. So, I mean, I think Muslim community organizations have a role to play, because so one of the dynamics I talk about in this book, especially around securitization, and I'm borrowing from, you know, my colleague and friend Tahir Abbas, who looks at this nexus between Islamophobia and Islamism and how Muslim youth have been recruited into this, where they can be pushed to the fringes of society and then look for other kinds of associations when they don't feel that citizenship and belonging, whether in their community or whether in the nation. And so I think a lot of the youth have found that, you know, they don't have spaces where they can have these conversations and dialogues about what they're experiencing, right? And there's not as much, you know, we spend a lot of energy in the Muslim community building mosques and so on, but, you know, where are the youth centers, right? You know, I went to a fabulous one in Budapest, right, where it was like a hotel, and, you know, and they had always had youth coming in from across Europe to do workshops, to do all kinds of events. I think we need to start to invest in, you know, Muslim youth who are the future and who have been socialized in a very unique context and have, you know, have had to deal with the challenges of that. But I don't think the community has gone far enough to create those kinds of spaces, both physical and, you know, affective spaces where they can, you know, speak to the kinds of challenges and also be architects in developing solutions to that are youth-led. So there's often these attempts to do youth work, which is like, you know, getting money to say, let's do all this work that, you know, makes them good civic citizens so they won't blow up the parliament buildings, right? A lot of that kind of youth promotion has been underwritten by really problematic CVE ideologies, right? And so, you know, and it assumes that youth are not engaged as civic citizens, right? If we can only make them good and integrated citizens, then they won't, you know, get involved in terrorism. Well, you know, let's look at what are the conditions that are, you know, created for them to follow these destructive paths, and very, very few of them are, but it's not that that you can say that it's not happening. But, you know, let's also appreciate what they are doing, what they can contribute, and support that. So when I look at the arts, you know, and I've looked at Muslim youth who are cultural producers, where's the support for that, you know, within our community? They have to go outside of it to try and find support, right? There's very little solidarity in the Muslim community, and it's very fractured, and we don't have social movements. You know, there is no, Islamophobia is such a global concern, right? But we don't have an Idle No More or a Black Lives Matter, because this isn't a community that has, you know, worked on political activism and solidarity building and creating social movements. And I think that, you know, this is what's lacking. And I think this is where youth could be very important in driving some of that, but the spaces have not been available for them. And so we lack advocacy. We don't have enough respected advocacy groups in this country. And we need to ensure that, you know, the youth that are coming up, especially those who want to not just be doctors, lawyers, and engineers, who want to go into the arts, who want to do media, who want to be cultural producers, you know, are able, you know, and supported to do that work, which benefits, you know, the entire community. So sorry, it's a, you know, lots of long and general kinds of suggestions, but I think that, you know, it's imperative that the community do more than they have to support this generation and the Gen Z that has come up as well.
Okay, let's see. That will conclude our Q&A for Dr. Zine. Thank you again so much for these very stimulating intellectual discussions, your presentations, and your book. I hope everybody will get that book when it comes out.